The morning, Sergeant Delia Marsh walked onto the qualification range at Fort Benning. The air smelled like gun oil and condescension. She had driven 4 hours from Fort Stewart the night before, slept 3 hours in her car, and eaten a granola bar she found in the bottom of her range bag. None of that mattered. What mattered was the distance marker at the far end of the range, a white placard nailed to a wooden post, almost invisible in the Georgia morning haze. 800 yards. Iron sights, and a roster sheet tacked to the staging table with her name at the very bottom, added in pencil, like an afterthought. The course evaluator, a master sergeant named Coulter, had looked at that name when she signed in. He had looked at her. Then he had looked back at the name, as if confirming the two were connected. "You're the one they sent from Stewart," he said. It was not a question. It was a category. She said, "Yes, sir." He handed her a range card and walked away. There were 11 other shooters on the roster, all men. 8 were active duty snipers from the 75th Ranger Regiment, there to cross-qualify on a new evaluation protocol the Army was piloting. 2 were warrant officers from military intelligence. 1 was a contractor whose background nobody discussed out loud. Delia was none of those things. She was a staff sergeant from a forward support battalion, a logistician by assignment, and she had gotten onto this roster because her battalion commander, Colonel Renata Vance, had personally called the range officer at Benning and asked for her to be included. Colonel Vance had not explained why. She rarely explained anything. She simply made things happen and trusted the results. What Colonel Vance knew, and what Master Sergeant Coulter did not yet know, was that Delia Marsh had been shooting since she was 7 years old. Her father, Staff Sergeant, retired, Harold Marsh, had grown up hunting in rural Kentucky, had qualified expert on every weapons system the Army handed him for 22 years, and had spent the better part of Delia's childhood teaching her that a rifle was not a weapon first. It was a physics problem. Wind speed, bullet drop, humidity, trigger pull, breath cycle. These were the variables. Patience was the constant. Her father had a way of explaining ballistics the way other fathers explained baseball statistics. Casually, thoroughly, without ever suggesting it was anything other than ordinary. By the time Delia was 12, she was shooting 500-yard groups that made the men at the civilian range outside Elizabethtown go quiet. By 16, she'd won 3 Kentucky State Junior Rifle Championships. By the time she enlisted at 21, she could read a crosswind by the way it moved the grass at the base of a target stand, and she did the wind correction in her head before most shooters had finished adjusting their scopes. She did not have a scope today. The evaluation protocol was explicit. M24 rifle, iron sights only, 10 rounds, 800 yards. The Army was studying whether sniper qualification had become too dependent on optics, whether the fundamentals were degrading. Someone at Traytock had written a white paper. Someone above them had agreed, and now 12 soldiers stood on a rifle range in the Georgia heat, trying to answer that question with their bodies. The Ranger snipers were not worried. They had trained on iron sights. 2 of them had done it in combat. They talked to each other in the easy, compressed language of men who share a specific kind of competence. Shorthand references, technical jokes, the casual mention of ranges and conditions that would mean nothing to anyone outside the community. They did not talk to Delia. One of them glanced at her once, at her unit patch, at the absence of a Ranger scroll or a combat infantry badge, and then looked away in a way that was not hostile but was complete. She was not part of the reference group. She did not compute. Coulter ran the safety brief. He explained the course of fire. 10 rounds, single shot, no spotters, no wind calls from a partner. Each shooter would have 5 minutes per string of 5 shots. Score was calculated by point value per ring, maximum 50 points per string, 100 total. Passing was 70. Expert was 90 or above. He did not say what happened if you didn't pass. He didn't have to. The first shooter stepped to the line. A Ranger staff sergeant, smooth and unhurried, who went through his natural respiratory pause like he was meditating. 5 shots. Coulter read the target through binoculars. 41. Good, not exceptional. The Ranger stepped back, face neutral, and made one small adjustment to his rear sight aperture. The second shooter went 38. The third, a compact warrant officer who shot left-handed, scored 44 on his first string. There was a murmur of genuine appreciation from the Ranger contingent. Delia was ninth on the roster. She used the weight the way her father had taught her. She watched, not the shooters. She'd seen enough of the fundamentals to know none of them were doing anything she couldn't learn in 5 minutes. She watched the range itself. The way the heat shimmer moved across the ground between the 400 and 600-yard lines. The way the target frame shivered slightly every 40 seconds or so, in a pattern that suggested a consistent light wind, coming from the right, at roughly 3 to 5 miles per hour, gusting intermittently. There was a stand of pines at the far left edge of the range, and their upper branches moved more than the lower ones, which told her the wind speed increased with altitude. Relevant if the bullet's arc peaked high, which at 800 yards it would. She was doing this quietly, standing slightly behind the line, holding her range card. One of the rangers, younger, with a specialist tab still visible under his staff sergeant rank, noticed her watching the trees. He followed her gaze, looked back at her, said nothing. When her turn came, Coulter handed her the M24 and stood back in the way that range officers stand back when they expect to observe something unremarkable. She settled into position at the bench, made her adjustments, elevation for 800 yards, a half-minute right for wind, and ran through her pre-shot routine without rushing. Breath in, halfway out, hold, press. The first shot broke cleanly. She did not look up. She already knew where it was going. She fired the remaining 4 rounds of the first string in just under 2 minutes, each shot separated by exactly the amount of time her respiratory cycle required, and no more. When Coulter read the target, he paused for a moment before he said the number. 48. The range went quiet in the specific way that ranges go quiet when something unexpected has happened. Not loud quiet, just attentive. The ranger who had watched her studying the trees looked over. He did not say anything, but his posture changed in a way that was the physical equivalent of a recalculation. Delia stepped back from the bench, checked the chamber, and waited for the second string. She shot a 47 on the second string, 95 out of 100, the highest score on the range that day by 6 points. Coulter recorded the number without expression. Then he looked at her unit patch again, the way he had when she signed in. This time the look was different. This time it was the look of a man trying to reconcile 2 things he had believed to be incompatible. "You qualified expert," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. He started to say something else, then didn't. He handed her the range card back and moved to the next shooter on the roster. Later in the staging area, the left-handed warrant officer came and stood next to her while she was breaking down her kit. His name tape said Olgin. He didn't make a production of it. He just stood there for a moment and then said, "Who taught you to read wind like that?" "My father," she said. Olgin nodded like that was a complete answer. Because it was. What she did not tell Olgin, what she had not told anyone on that range, was that her father had never received the credit he was owed for teaching her. Not formally, not in any way the Army had ever acknowledged. Harold Marsh had served for 22 years. He had been, by every account of the men who served with him, one of the finest marksmen his unit had ever produced. In 1991, during the Gulf War, his company had been caught in a communications blackout during a nighttime advance near the Kuwaiti border. Their maps were wrong, a print error that had placed a grid line 200 meters east of its actual position. The lead vehicle had already started down a route that would have put them directly into a Republican Guard position that hadn't been on any of the briefing imagery. Harold Marsh, working from iron sights and a compass bearing he'd taken 3 hours earlier, had identified the error, calculated the correct route from memory, and guided his company around the engagement without a casualty. 2 days later, a parallel unit that took the route on the original map lost 4 men. His company commander had submitted him for the Silver Star. The paperwork moved up through the chain. It was reviewed. It was approved at the battalion level. And then it reached the Brigade S1. A major named, according to the documents Delia had spent years trying to locate, Philip Greer, and it stopped. Greer had a history with Harold Marsh that predated the war. Years earlier, at a post in Germany, Marsh had filed a complaint against Greer, then a captain, for falsifying maintenance records on a vehicle fleet. The complaint had gone nowhere in the official sense, but it had made Greer's evaluation period uncomfortable, and Greer remembered things that made him uncomfortable. The Silver Star packet did not disappear. It was not shredded or burned. It was simply rerouted, recharacterized, and downgraded to an Army Commendation Medal with a brief notation that the original recommendation had contained unverifiable field assessments. Harold Marsh received the ARCOM. He accepted it without public complaint because he was a 20-year sergeant, and he understood that certain arguments cost more than they returned. He came home from the Gulf. He finished his service. He taught his daughter to shoot, and he never told her about the Silver Star because he didn't want her to carry something he had decided to set down. He died of a cardiac event in 2019 at the age of 63. He was buried at Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville with full military honors, and an ARCOM he had earned twice over, and a commendation he had never received. Delia found out about the Silver Star from a man named Reuben Kraft. Kraft was 81 years old and lived in a veterans care facility in Clarksville, Tennessee. He had been her father's RTO, radio operator, during the Gulf. He had been present when the company commander signed the original nomination packet. He had assumed for 28 years that Harold Marsh had received it. When Delia visited him in the spring of 2022 to talk about her father, she was working on a family history, a project she had started after the funeral because she needed somewhere to put the grief. Kraft mentioned the Silver Star in passing, the way you mention something everyone already knows. She did not already know. She sat in a plastic chair in the sunroom of a veterans care facility and listened to Reuben Kraft describe watching her father guide 60 soldiers around an ambush in the dark, using nothing but memory and a compass, and the kind of spatial intelligence that cannot be trained, only refined. Kraft, said Harold Marsh, had done it quietly, without ceremony, the way he did everything. He said the company commander had cried when he signed the packet. He said he had always assumed the medal was somewhere in a box in Harold's house. Delia drove back to Fort Stewart that night in 4 hours and 30 minutes and did not stop once. She could not have explained what she felt. It was not rage, exactly. It was something older and heavier than rage. It was the particular grief of learning that someone you loved had been made to carry a theft they never told you about. She started filing requests the next morning. The Army's awards correction process runs through the Army Review Board's agency, and it moves at the speed of institutional caution. Delia submitted an application for correction of military records under 10 U.S.C. 1552. She gathered statements from Reuben Kraft. She located 2 other members of her father's company through a Gulf War veterans network, a man named Aldous Tate from Baton Rouge, and a retired chief warrant officer named Sandra Crew from Colorado Springs, and both of them provided sworn affidavits confirming the original recommendation and the circumstances of Harold Marsh's actions that night. She also filed a FOIA request for Major Philip Greer's personnel file. What came back 6 months later was incomplete but sufficient. There was a memorandum, typed on standard military letterhead, from Greer's desk to the Brigade S1 section, dated March 1992, describing the Marsh packet as having insufficient documentation of individual initiative versus unit action. There was no supporting evidence for this characterization. There were no interviews conducted. The downgrade had taken 3 days from receipt to processing. 3 days and 28 years. The ARBA process took 14 months. There were delays, a request for additional documentation, a period when her assigned case reviewer changed, and the file had to be refamiliarized. A stretch of 3 months when she received no communication at all and had to call a congressional liaison office to get the case status updated. She did all of this while working a full-time job as a logistics staff sergeant, deploying for 8 months to Kuwait on a support rotation, and sitting for her promotion board. She made Sergeant First Class in March of 2023. She was at work when the ARBA notification came through on her personal email. She read it twice, standing in the motor pool parking lot in a reflective belt, before she believed it. The Army had determined that the original downgrade of Harold Marsh's Silver Star nomination was not supported by the documentary record. The ARCOM would stand. He had earned that independently, but the Silver Star would be added to his official record. And because Harold Marsh was deceased, the award would be presented posthumously to his next of kin. Delia was his only child. The ceremony was held on a Tuesday in November at the Post Auditorium at Fort Campbell, because that was where Harold Marsh had been stationed at the time of his Gulf deployment. It was a small ceremony by military standards, perhaps 70 people, mostly veterans of Harold's unit who had made the trip, along with Reuben Kraft, who arrived in a wheelchair pushed by his granddaughter, and Sandra Crew, who had driven from Colorado Springs because she said she had been waiting 30 years to see this happen. The post-commanding general presented the medal. He read the citation, which described Harold Marsh's actions on the night of February 24, 1991, in language that was formal and specific and accurate in every detail. When he finished reading, he turned to Delia and presented the case. Inside was the silver star, suspended from its ribbon, catching the auditorium light. She did not cry during the ceremony. She had promised herself she wouldn't, and she was, among other things, a person who kept promises she made to herself. She shook the general's hand. She said, "Thank you." She held the case with both hands the way her father had taught her to hold a rifle. Not tightly, not loosely, but with intention. Reuben Kraft caught her eye from across the room. He was 90 yards away at least, across folding chairs and standing personnel and the particular blur of a room full of people. She could still read his expression clearly. He nodded once. She nodded back. Afterward, in the parking lot, Sandra Crew found her. Crew was 67, compact and direct, with the manner of someone who had long since stopped performing warmth she didn't feel and so radiated a kind of unadorned sincerity instead. She had served 30 years herself. She didn't offer condolences or congratulations. She said, he knew what he did that night. Whatever else happened, he knew. Delia thought about that for a long time afterward, about what it meant to know the value of your own actions in the absence of anyone else acknowledging them, about whether that was consolation or simply a different category of loss. She decided it was both. That was the honest answer. It was both. There is a detail that came out in the ARBA proceedings that Delia had not known until she read the case file. On the night Harold Marsh guided his company to safety, he had been running a fever of 102 degrees. He had not reported it because they were inside a communications blackout and there was no one to report it to who could have helped. He had done the calculations, bearing, distance, rate of march, alternate route geometry, while running a fever that would have sent most people to a cot. When she read that, she set the file down and looked at the wall for a while. She thought about the years she had spent learning what he had tried to teach her. The way he explained wind, the way he talked about distance, not as an obstacle but as a variable to be solved. The way he had never once suggested that what he was passing on to her was anything remarkable, even though she understood now that it had always been, that he had been remarkable in the specific and unglamorous way that people are remarkable when nobody is watching, and they do the right thing anyway. She thought about a morning on a rifle range in Kentucky, when she was 9 years old, and he had shown her how to read the grass at the base of a target frame to estimate wind speed. She had asked him how he knew all of this. He had shrugged in the way he always shrugged, not dismissive, just honest, and said, "I paid attention." That was the whole answer. He had paid attention. For 22 years, in Germany and in the Gulf and in Kentucky and everywhere else. Harold Marsh had paid attention, and that attention had saved lives and shaped his daughter and outlasted the bureaucratic indifference of a major who had rerouted his recognition because of a grudge and forgotten about it before the ink was dry. Major Philip Greer retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1998. His retirement ceremony was attended by colleagues who described him as a solid officer and a dedicated professional. His name appears nowhere in the ARBA findings by design. The board's mandate is to correct the record, not to prosecute the cause of the error. That is the mechanism. It works the way it works, slowly and without satisfaction, and Delia understood that going in. She did not appeal for a review of Greer's conduct. She thought about it. She decided it would cost her something she didn't want to spend, and that the outcome was uncertain, and that the record now said what it should say. That would have to be enough. Some days it was enough. Other days the weight of what her father had carried, alone and uncomplaining, settled on her in the specific way that grief settles on people who only learn the full story too late to share it with the person they learned it for. She keeps the silver star in a shadow box her unit's family readiness group made for her after the ceremony. Dark walnut, glass front, his photograph on the left, the medal on the right, the citation folded behind. It hangs in her apartment in Columbus, Georgia, in the hallway between the living room and the kitchen, where she walks past it every morning. She is a sergeant first class now. She still shoots. She qualified expert again last spring, this time on a formal sniper familiarization course that the Army does not typically offer to logistics personnel, but which her battalion commander, Colonel Vance, still making things happen, arranged for her to attend. She shot a 92. On the range that day, there was a young specialist who had been watching her shoot and who eventually asked, in the way that junior soldiers ask things from senior NCOs when they're not sure if the question is allowed, whether she had ever shot competitively. She said no, not formally. He asked where she had learned to shoot like that. She said her father taught her. He asked if her father was in the Army. She said yes, he was. The specialist nodded and looked back downrange, toward the distance markers, toward the heat shimmer and the far targets, and the long space between intention and impact that every shooter eventually learns to live inside of. She let him look. She knew what he was seeing. She had been seeing it her whole life. That distance, that problem, that patient, solvable, beautiful problem. Her father had given her that. Whatever else had been taken from him, whatever acknowledgement had been rerouted and downgraded and filed away by a man with a grievance and a pen, that part was still hers. It had always been hers. The silver star was his. The shot belonged to her.